Around 2600 BCE, in the floodplains of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, a civilization emerged that would grow to encompass more than 1,000,000 square kilometers. The Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan civilization, built cities with a degree of urban planning that would not be matched anywhere in the ancient world for centuries. Streets ran at right angles. Buildings were constructed from standardized bricks. Underground drainage systems carried waste away from residential areas with a precision that suggested not improvisation, but deliberate engineering. Then, by approximately 1900 BCE, the major urban centers began to empty. The population dispersed. The writing system fell out of use. The standardized material culture dissolved. Mainstream archaeology has proposed climate change and river shifts as primary causes. But the precision of what was built and the completeness of what disappeared continues to raise questions that no single explanation has fully resolved. Urban planning as a deliberate and systematic practice is generally associated with the administrative demands of centralized states. It requires a governing body with the authority to impose standardization, the technical capacity to survey land and execute measurements, and the organizational infrastructure to enforce compliance across large populations and long construction periods. When archaeologists first began excavating Mohenjo-daro in the 1920s, they expected to find the scattered remnants of an early settlement. What they uncovered instead was a city laid out with a geometric precision that had no precedent in the archaeological record of the region. The streets of Mohenjo-daro did not develop organically. They were not the product of footpaths worn into the ground over generations, gradually widened by use. They ran in straight lines, intersecting at right angles, forming a grid that divided the city into clearly defined residential and functional zones. The main thoroughfares measured approximately 10 meters wide. Secondary streets were narrower but maintained consistent proportions. This regularity was not accidental. It reflected a prior decision about how the city would be organized before a single building was constructed. What makes this observation significant is the time frame. Mohenjo-daro was being built around 2600 BCE. At that same period, the cities of Mesopotamia were growing through a process of gradual accretion, with irregular street layouts that reflected organic expansion rather than planned design. Egypt's urban settlements of the same era similarly lacked the grid format. The Harappan grid predates the systematic urban planning documented in classical Greece by nearly 2,000 years. The question this raises is not simply one of technical achievement. It is a question about the kind of social and administrative organization that would have been required to conceive, design, and execute that level of planning at that point in human history. The excavations at Harappa, located approximately 600 kilometers northeast of Mohenjo-daro, revealed the same pattern. A different city, separated by a substantial distance, built according to the same organizational logic. The streets aligned to cardinal directions. The residential blocks followed consistent proportions. The drainage infrastructure integrated into the construction rather than added as an afterthought. When two cities separated by hundreds of kilometers display the same planning logic, the explanation cannot be local innovation. It implies a shared standard, a common technical framework applied across a civilization that spanned a vast geographic area. That geographic span is itself a point of analytical significance. The Indus Valley Civilization at its peak extended across more than 1,000,000 square kilometers, from the foothills of the Himalayas in the north to the coastal regions of present-day Gujarat in the south, and from the eastern Punjab across to the Iranian borderlands in the west. It was, by territorial extent, larger than both ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Yet despite this scale, The material culture remained strikingly consistent. The brick sizes were standardized. The weight and measurement systems were uniform. The urban layout followed the same principles whether the city was located in the northern highlands or the southern coastal plains. This consistency across such a large territory raises a question that archaeology has not fully answered. How was that standardization maintained without the administrative apparatus that other ancient civilizations used to enforce uniformity? Egypt had a centralized pharaonic state with an extensive bureaucracy. Mesopotamian city-states used cuneiform record-keeping to coordinate economic and administrative activity across their territories. The Harappans left behind no comparable evidence of centralized administrative control. No palace complexes have been identified. No royal burial sites have been found. No monumental inscriptions record the names of rulers or the victories of kings. The standardization existed without the visible institutional framework that historians would normally expect to produce it. The brick question alone is worth examining in detail. Across the entire expanse of the Indus Valley Civilization, fired bricks were produced in a ratio of approximately 1 to 2 to 4, meaning the thickness, width, and length maintained consistent proportional relationships. This was not a local convention that happened to spread. Archaeological analysis confirms that bricks from sites separated by hundreds of kilometers conform to the same ratio. Producing bricks to a standard ratio requires either a centralized production and distribution system or a shared technical knowledge so deeply embedded in construction practice that it was replicated independently at every site. Neither explanation is simple. Both imply a level of coordination or cultural coherence that the current evidence does not fully account for. The drainage systems add another layer to this problem. In most ancient cities, drainage was rudimentary. Waste removal was managed at the household level, with little integration into a broader urban infrastructure. At Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, the drainage systems were built into the city's design from the beginning. Covered brick channels ran beneath the streets, connecting individual households to larger collector drains that carried waste to the city's perimeter. The systems required regular maintenance, implying an organized workforce responsible for their upkeep. They also required that construction across the entire city follow compatible specifications, since a drainage network only functions when its components are properly integrated. What the grid reveals, when examined in this way, is not simply a planning achievement. It is evidence of a civilization operating according to shared principles, applied consistently across an enormous territory, without leaving behind the institutional records that would explain how that consistency was achieved. That absence is not a minor gap in the historical record. It is one of the central puzzles of Harappan archaeology, and it shapes every subsequent question about how this civilization functioned and why it eventually ceased to exist in the form that built these cities. Among the most consequential obstacles in Harappan research is the fact that the civilization's writing system has never been deciphered. This is not a problem of insufficient material. Archaeologists have recovered more than 4,000 inscribed objects from Indus Valley sites, including seals, tablets, pottery, and small copper implements. The script appears on these objects in a form consistent enough to confirm that it was a functioning writing system, rather than a collection of decorative symbols. Yet after more than a century of analysis, no scholarly consensus has been reached on what the script represents, what language it encodes, or what any individual sign means. The implications of this failure extend far beyond linguistics. In every other major ancient civilization whose history is substantially understood, written records provide the interpretive framework. Egyptian hieroglyphics gave scholars access to religious texts, administrative records, royal decrees, and historical accounts. Mesopotamian cuneiform preserved legal codes economic transactions, mythological narratives, and diplomatic correspondence. These written sources allow historians to reconstruct not just what ancient people built, but how they thought, what they valued, how their institutions functioned, and how their societies changed over time. For the Indus Valley Civilization, that entire dimension of historical understanding is inaccessible. Everything known about Harappan society must be inferred from physical remains alone. The script itself presents several characteristics that have complicated decipherment efforts. It is written from right to left in most examples, though some longer inscriptions appear to use a bastrophodon format, alternating direction with each line. It contains approximately 400 to 600 distinct signs, depending on how sign variants are classified. This number falls between the typical range for alphabetic systems, which generally use fewer than 40 signs, and the range for purely logographic systems, which often employ thousands. The sign count is most consistent with a logosyllabic system, in which some signs represent words or morphemes, and others represent syllabic sounds, similar in structure to early Sumerian cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphics. However, this structural inference has not been confirmed because no bilingual text equivalent to the Rosetta Stone has been found for the Indus script. The length of the inscriptions poses an additional problem. The vast majority of known Indus texts are extremely short. The average inscription contains only 5 signs. The longest known inscription contains 26 signs. These lengths are insufficient to apply standard statistical decipherment methods, which require longer texts with enough repetition to identify recurring patterns, grammatical structures, and probable word boundaries. The shortness of the inscriptions suggests that the script was used primarily for labeling rather than for extended narrative or administrative documentation. If the Harappans kept detailed written records, those records have not survived, possibly because they were written on perishable materials, such as palm leaves or cloth that decomposed in the archaeological record. Several major decipherment attempts have been made over the past century, each proposing a different underlying language. One influential hypothesis, associated with the Finnish scholar Asko Parpola, proposes that the Indus script encodes a Dravidian language ancestral to the South Indian language family. Parpola's analysis draws on iconographic connections between the signs and possible Dravidian word roots, using a rebus principle in which a sign representing an object is used phonetically for its sound value rather than its meaning. This approach has produced interpretive readings for some signs, but the proposed readings have not achieved broad scholarly acceptance because they cannot be independently verified without a known text in a related language for comparison. An alternative hypothesis proposes that the script encodes an early form of Indo-Aryan, connecting the Harappan civilization linguistically to the Vedic tradition that emerged in the subcontinent after the urban phase ended. This interpretation carries significant implications for the contested debate about the origins of Indo-Aryan languages and their relationship to the Indus Valley population. Proponents of this view point to continuities between certain Harappan material symbols and later Vedic iconography. Critics argue that the linguistic and archaeological evidence does not support an Indo-Aryan identification for the script, and that the hypothesis is shaped more by ideological considerations about South Asian cultural origins than by rigorous linguistic analysis. A third position, held by a minority of researchers including the computational linguist Richard Sproat, argues that the Indus script may not be a writing system encoding language at all, but rather a set of non-linguistic symbols used for identification, ownership marking, or ritual purposes. Sproat's statistical analysis of sign distribution patterns found that the Indus script behaves differently from known writing systems in certain measurable ways. suggesting it may belong to a different category of symbolic communication. This hypothesis was sharply contested by other researchers, who published counter-analyses arguing that the statistical methods Sproat used were flawed, and that the sign distribution data is in fact consistent with a genuine writing system. The debate remains unresolved. What is certain is that the inability to read the Indus script creates a fundamental asymmetry in the comparative study of ancient civilizations. The administrative, religious, and social dimensions of Harappan life that writing would normally illuminate remain opaque. The seals on which the script most frequently appears were clearly objects of significance, used across a wide geographic area and found at trade sites as distant as Mesopotamia. They carried meaning that was understood by the people who used them. What that meaning was, and what it reveals about the civilization that produced it, remains one of the most consequential, unanswered questions in the archaeology of the ancient world. The standardization of fired bricks across the Indus Valley Civilization is one of the most technically specific anomalies in the archaeological record of the ancient world. It is not a general similarity in construction technique. It is a precise, measurable uniformity in the proportional dimensions of bricks produced at sites separated by distances that, in the 3rd millennium BCE, would have required weeks of travel to traverse. That level of standardization does not emerge spontaneously. It requires either a centralized production and distribution network, a formal system for transmitting technical specifications across large distances, or a cultural practice so deeply embedded in construction traditions that it was reproduced consistently without direct administrative enforcement. Each of these explanations carries different implications for how the Harappan civilization was organized, and none of them is adequately supported by the current archaeological evidence. The specific ratio that defines Harappan bricks is 1 to 2 to 4. A brick measuring 1 unit in thickness measures 2 units in width and 4 units in length. This ratio was not arbitrary. It has structural advantages in masonry construction, allowing bricks to be interlocked in ways that distribute load more effectively than bricks with less consistent proportions. The ratio appears in bricks from Mohenjo-daro, from Harappa, from the coastal city of Lothal in present-day Gujarat, from Rakhigarhi in Haryana, and from dozens of smaller sites spread across the full territorial extent of the civilization. The actual dimensions vary between sites, reflecting different local measurement units, but the proportional relationship between thickness, width, and length remains consistent. This distinction is important. It means the standardization was not imposed through the distribution of a single physical template, but through the transmission of an abstract principle that was then applied using local measurement conventions. That observation shifts the question from logistics to knowledge transmission. How was a proportional standard communicated and maintained across a civilization covering more than 1 million square kilometers over a period of several centuries without a documented administrative system for enforcing it? The comparison with other ancient standardization efforts is instructive. In Mesopotamia, the standardization of weights and measures was enforced through state institutions. Administrative texts record the official standards, and inspectors monitored compliance in commercial transactions. The state apparatus was both the origin and the enforcer of standardization. In Egypt, the royal cubit was the official unit of measurement, defined by a physical standard kept in the royal administration, with copies distributed to officials throughout the kingdom. The standardization was inseparable from the administrative structure of the state. For the Harappans, no equivalent administrative mechanism has been identified. No palace complex functioning as a central administrative hub has been excavated. No texts recording official standards have been found, partly because the script remains undeciphered but also because the inscriptions recovered are too short to contain the kind of regulatory content that administrative standardization would typically produce. The weight system used across the civilization is equally precise. Stone weights recovered from multiple sites conform to a binary and decimal progression, with units doubling in a consistent pattern. The smallest weights are approximately 0.86 grams, and the sequence scales upward through a series of doublings and decimal multiples. This system was used across the full geographic range of the civilization, implying that commercial and administrative transactions throughout the Indus world operated according to a shared metrological framework. The combination of standardized bricks and standardized weights suggests that the Harappans were operating within a shared technical culture that regulated both construction and commerce according to common principles. The consistency of this culture across vast distances and over long periods of time implies a degree of social cohesion and shared identity that archaeology has not yet explained. One interpretation, proposed by several researchers including Jonathan Mark Knoyer of the University of Wisconsin, is that the standardization reflects not top-down administrative enforcement, but a deeply embedded craft tradition maintained by specialized guilds or professional communities whose knowledge and practices were transmitted through apprenticeship rather than through formal state regulation. Under this model, brickmakers and traders across the Indus world belonged to professional communities that shared technical standards as part of their occupational identity, maintaining consistency through social rather than institutional mechanisms. This interpretation has a degree of plausibility, but it raises its own analytical difficulties. Guild-based standardization in historical periods has generally operated within relatively bounded geographic areas, maintained through regular contact between practitioners and the transmission of physical standards. Maintaining proportional consistency across the full expanse of the Indus Valley Civilization would have required either regular long-distance contact between craft communities or a training tradition capable of transmitting abstract proportional principles with sufficient precision to be reproduced without physical reference to a master standard. Neither condition is impossible, but both require a degree of organized professional communication that leaves no direct trace in the archaeological record. The fired brick itself is worth examining as a technological choice. Sun-dried mud brick was the standard construction material in Mesopotamia and Egypt during the same period. Fired brick, which requires kilns capable of reaching sustained high temperatures and a reliable fuel supply, is significantly more labor-intensive and resource-demanding to produce. The Harappans used fired brick not just for monumental or elite construction, but for ordinary residential buildings throughout their cities. The scale of fired brick production implied by the archaeological record represents an enormous investment of labor and fuel resources. Some researchers have estimated that the deforestation associated with brick production may itself have been a contributing factor in the later environmental degradation of the Indus region, though this remains a hypothesis rather than a demonstrated conclusion. What the brick standardization ultimately documents is a civilization whose technical culture operated according to shared principles, applied at a scale, and with a consistency that has no clear parallel in the ancient world. The administrative silence that surrounds this standardization is not simply a gap in the record. It represents a fundamental difference between the Harappan civilization and the other great urban civilizations of the 3rd millennium BCE. A difference whose implications for understanding how complex societies can be organized and maintained have not been fully absorbed into the broader theoretical frameworks of ancient history. Every major urban civilization in the ancient world has left behind evidence of hierarchical power, The evidence takes different forms in different societies, but its presence is consistent enough to function as something close to an archaeological rule. In Egypt, royal power expressed itself through monumental tomb complexes, colossal statuary, and inscriptions recording the names and achievements of pharaohs across thousands of years. In Mesopotamia, palace complexes occupied central positions within city layouts, and royal archives documented the administrative functions of ruling dynasties. In early China, elite burials contained grave goods that announced social rank through the quality and quantity of objects interred with the dead. In the Indus Valley Civilization, the archaeological record presents an almost complete absence of these markers. There are no identified royal tombs. There are no monumental statues depicting rulers. There are no inscriptions naming kings or recording military conquests. The civilization that built the most extensively planned cities of the ancient world did so without leaving any clear physical evidence of the individuals or institutions that directed the process. This absence has been interpreted in fundamentally different ways by researchers working in the field. One position holds that the Harappans did have a ruling elite, but that this elite expressed its power through forms that either have not survived in the archaeological record or have not yet been recognized as markers of elite status. Under this interpretation, the absence of royal tombs does not mean there were no rulers, only that Harappan rulers did not adopt burial practices designed to project power into the archaeological record. The absence of palace complexes does not mean there were no administrative centers, only that the buildings used for administration were not constructed on a monumental scale that would make them immediately identifiable as distinct from other large civic structures. A second position argues that the Harappan civilization was genuinely different in its social structure from the palace-centered civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia, and that the absence of royal markers reflects a real difference in how political authority was organized, rather than a gap in archaeological visibility. Proponents of this view point to the relatively uniform quality of residential construction in Harappan cities as evidence against extreme social stratification. While some houses were clearly larger than others, the variation in residential scale was less pronounced than in contemporary Mesopotamian cities, where elite residential compounds were dramatically larger than ordinary dwellings. The Harappan record suggests a society with social differentiation, but without the extreme concentration of wealth and power that characterized the palace economies of the ancient Near East. The structures that have been identified as potentially elite or administrative in function are difficult to interpret with confidence. At Mohenjo-daro, a large building known as the granary was initially interpreted as a centralized storage facility for agricultural surplus, implying a redistributive economy controlled by a central authority. Later analysis challenged this interpretation, with some researchers arguing that the structural evidence does not support a granary function and that the building's purpose remains uncertain. Another large structure, the so-called college or assembly hall, has been interpreted as a meeting place for civic or administrative functions. But this identification is similarly inferential rather than documented. The interpretive uncertainty surrounding these buildings reflects the broader problem of reading administrative function from architectural form alone, without written records to confirm the identification. The citadel mounds present at both Mohenjo-daro and Harappa have been interpreted as evidence of spatial hierarchy within the city, with elevated areas reserved for civic or ritual functions distinct from ordinary residential use. At Mohenjo-daro, the western mound rises approximately 12 meters above the surrounding plain and contains the Great Bath, the granary, and a series of large buildings whose functions are debated. The separation between the elevated citadel and the lower residential city has been read as evidence of a distinction between elite and ordinary spaces. However, no structures on the citadel clearly resemble the throne rooms, treasure houses, or royal apartments that characterize palace complexes in other ancient civilizations. The citadel contained important civic structures, but those structures do not conform to the template of royal architecture seen elsewhere in the ancient world. The burial evidence compounds the interpretive difficulty. Harappan cemeteries have been excavated at several sites, and while the burials show some variation in the quantity of grave goods, the differences are not dramatic enough to suggest the kind of extreme social stratification that produces royal tombs. The burials are generally oriented in consistent directions and accompanied by pottery vessels, personal ornaments, and occasionally copper tools or weapons. There are no burials that stand out as unambiguously royal in the way that the royal cemetery at Ur, with its human sacrifices and extraordinary wealth of grave goods, identifies elite Mesopotamian burials. The Harappan dead were treated with consistency that implies a shared set of mortuary beliefs, but does not reveal a clear hierarchy of social rank expressed through burial practice. Some researchers have proposed that the Harappan elite expressed its status through control of long-distance trade rather than through monumental construction or elaborate burial. The presence of Harappan seals and artifacts at sites in Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf region documents a trading network that extended far beyond the boundaries of the Indus world. Control of access to prestige goods moving through these trade networks could have been the basis of elite status in Harappan society, a form of power that would not necessarily generate the kinds of archaeological markers associated with territorially based political authority. Under this model, the Harappan elite were merchants and trade controllers rather than territorial rulers, and their power was expressed through economic relationships that left different traces in the material record than the monumental construction programs of agrarian palace economies. This hypothesis is consistent with certain aspects of the Harappan record, particularly the evidence for standardized weights and the widespread distribution of Harappan seals across the trading networks of the ancient Near East. But it does not fully account for the organizational capacity required to plan and construct cities at the scale of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. Large-scale urban construction requires the ability to mobilize and coordinate labor, to manage the logistics of material supply, and to maintain consistent technical standards over the extended periods that major construction projects require. These are functions that, in other ancient societies, were performed by state institutions with coercive authority. Whether a trade-based elite could have performed equivalent functions through economic incentives and social prestige rather than political authority remains an open question that the current evidence cannot definitively resolve. The water management systems at Mohenjo-daro represent a level of hydraulic engineering that was not matched in urban contexts elsewhere in the ancient world until much later periods. This is not a general observation about the presence of drainage at the site. It is a specific claim about the systematic integration of water supply, wastewater removal, and sanitation infrastructure into the urban fabric at a scale and with a technical sophistication that places the Harappans in a distinct category among ancient civilizations. Understanding what that infrastructure consisted of, how it functioned, and what it required to build and maintain raises questions about the organizational capacity of Harappan society that go beyond what the physical remains alone can answer. The most visible component of Mohenjo-daro's water infrastructure is the drainage system. Covered brick channels ran beneath the main streets, collecting wastewater from individual households and directing it toward the city's perimeter. The channels were built from fired brick and covered with removable brick or stone slabs that allowed maintenance workers to access the interior for cleaning and repair. Individual houses connected to the street drains through smaller channels that pass through the walls at street level. The design required that household drainage and street drainage be planned as a coordinated system, with compatible specifications at the connection points. This is not a system that could have been added to an existing city as an improvement. It had to be designed into the city's infrastructure from the beginning of construction. The scale of the drainage network implies a large and organized maintenance workforce. Covered brick channels accumulate sediment and require periodic cleaning to remain functional. The sluice points, where smaller drains connected to larger collectors would have required regular inspection. The system as a whole represented a civic infrastructure that needed ongoing institutional support to remain operational. In contemporary cities, drainage maintenance is a municipal function, managed by a public authority with the resources and legal mandate to coordinate maintenance across the entire system. At Mohenjo-daro, no institutional record of such an authority survives. The existence of the drainage network implies its existence. The absence of direct evidence for it is part of the broader administrative silence that characterizes the Harappan record. The water supply infrastructure is equally significant. At Mohenjo-daro, archaeologists have identified more than 700 wells distributed throughout the city. The density of wells relative to the estimated population of the city, which various researchers have placed between 20,000 and 50,000 residents at its peak, is remarkably high. The wells were constructed from carefully fitted wedge-shaped bricks arranged in a tapering cylinder that maintained structural integrity as it descended into the ground. The technical skill required to construct these wells was considerable, and their distribution throughout the residential areas of the city suggests that access to clean water was a broadly shared civic resource rather than a privilege restricted to elite areas. The relationship between the well distribution and the drainage system reveals something important about the hydraulic thinking that underpinned Harappan urban design. In many ancient urban contexts, water supply and waste disposal were managed independently, with contamination of water sources by waste a common and frequently lethal problem. At Mohenjo-daro, the drainage channels were covered and directed away from the well locations, suggesting an awareness of the relationship between waste disposal and water contamination that informed the design of both systems simultaneously. Whether this represents a formal understanding of germ theory or simply an empirical recognition that proximity of waste to water sources caused illness, the design consequence was a separation of supply and waste systems that reduced contamination risk compared to contemporary urban water management in other ancient civilizations. The bathrooms attached to individual houses at Mohenjo-daro constitute another dimension of the water infrastructure. A significant proportion of excavated residential structures contained dedicated bathing areas, typically located on the ground floor near the street wall, where drainage connections to the street channels were located. The floors of these bathing areas were constructed from tightly fitted fired brick, often with a slight slope toward a drain point, suggesting that the design was specifically intended for the management of water during bathing. The investment in dedicated bathing facilities within ordinary residential buildings implies that regular bathing was a normalized social practice across a broad segment of the population, not a luxury restricted to elite households. This pattern has been interpreted in several different ways. Some researchers have read the ubiquity of bathing facilities as evidence of ritual purity practices, connecting Harappan water culture to the ritual bathing traditions that appear in later South Asian religious contexts, particularly within Hinduism, where bathing in sacred water is a purification practice with deep cultural roots. Others have argued for a more practical interpretation, seeing the bathing facilities as evidence of a public health culture that recognized the personal hygiene benefits of regular washing without necessarily embedding those practices in a ritual framework. The distinction between these interpretations matters because it affects how the relationship between Harappan material culture and later South Asian cultural traditions is understood. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro occupies a specific position within this interpretive discussion. Located on the elevated citadel mound, the Great Bath is a large rectangular pool measuring approximately 12 meters in length, 7 meters in width, and nearly 3 meters in depth. It was constructed from tightly fitted brick with a layer of natural tar applied to the exterior walls and floor to create a watertight seal. The pool was surrounded by a corridor with small rooms opening off it, and the entire complex was elevated above the surrounding structures on the citadel. It was fed by a large well and drained through a covered channel. The technical quality of its construction is exceptional, representing a higher standard of hydraulic engineering than the residential bathing facilities in the lower city. The combination of its prominent location on the citadel, its size relative to the residential bathing facilities, and the investment in its construction has led most researchers to conclude that the Great Bath served a public or ritual function distinct from ordinary residential bathing. What that function was precisely, and who controlled access to it, cannot be determined from the physical evidence alone. It remains one of the most analyzed and least conclusively interpreted structures in Harappan archaeology, a monument whose engineering is clear and whose purpose is not. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro has been interpreted through several different analytical frameworks since its excavation in the 1920s, and the interpretive disagreements surrounding it reflect broader uncertainties about the nature of Harappan religion, social organization, and the relationship between civic and ritual life in the Indus Valley Civilization. The structure itself is well documented. Its dimensions, construction techniques, and associated architectural features have been recorded in detail. What remains contested is the social function that all of this technical investment was intended to serve, and what that function reveals about the civilization that built it. The initial interpretation, offered by John Marshall, the director of the Archaeological Survey of India, who led the early excavations at Mohenjo-daro, was that the Great Bath served a religious purification function analogous to the ritual bathing tanks associated with Hindu temples in later South Asian tradition. Marshall drew connections between the Great Bath and the concept of ritual purity through water that is deeply embedded in the religious culture of South Asia, arguing that the structure represented an early expression of a religious tradition that would later develop into the elaborate bathing rituals of Hinduism. This interpretation positioned the Great Bath as evidence of religious continuity between the Harappan civilization and the later cultural traditions of the Indian subcontinent. Marshall's interpretation was influential, but has been subjected to significant criticism over the subsequent decades. One line of critique focuses on the methodological problem of using later cultural traditions to interpret earlier archaeological remains. The presence of ritual bathing in Hinduism does not by itself demonstrate that the Great Bath served a ritual function, because the connection between the two requires an unbroken chain of cultural transmission that cannot be verified with the available evidence. The gap between the end of the Harappan urban phase and the earliest well-documented expressions of the Hindu ritual tradition is substantial, and the mechanisms by which practices from one might have been transmitted to the other are not clearly established. Using later traditions as a key to earlier archaeological remains is a recognized interpretive strategy, but it carries risks of circular reasoning when the connection itself is what is being argued. A second critique questions whether the architectural evidence actually supports the ritual interpretation or simply the interpretation of public use. The small rooms surrounding the Great Bath have been compared by some researchers to the changing rooms or priestly quarters associated with later temple bathing facilities. but the comparison is suggestive rather than demonstrative. The rooms are small, and their contents, as excavated, do not reveal their specific function with clarity. They could have served multiple purposes, and the assumption that they functioned as ritual preparation spaces imports an interpretive framework that the physical evidence does not independently confirm. Alternative interpretations have been proposed that do not rely on a ritual framework. Some researchers have suggested that the Great Bath may have served a social or civic function, functioning as a public bathing facility for the inhabitants of the citadel area, rather than as a site of religious practice. Under this interpretation, the elevated location of the Great Bath reflects the spatial organization of the citadel as a civic precinct rather than as a sacred precinct. And the investment in its construction reflects the importance placed on hygiene and water access in Harappan culture generally, expressed here at a larger and more elaborate scale. This interpretation connects the Great Bath to the broader pattern of water infrastructure at Mohenjo-daro, rather than treating it as an exceptional structure requiring a special religious explanation. A third interpretive position, associated with researchers who emphasize the political dimensions of ancient urban architecture, proposes that the Great Bath may have functioned as a space for the performance of social identity and authority, with access to the facility, serving as a marker of social standing within the citadel community. Large communal water facilities in later historical contexts have sometimes functioned as spaces where social hierarchies were simultaneously displayed and reinforced, with the physical quality of the facility and the social occasion of its use serving to define the community of those who had access to it. Under this model, the Great Bath was neither purely religious nor purely hygienic, but served as a civic institution whose use was embedded in the social practices through which Harappan elites defined their collective identity. The seals recovered from the citadel area at Mohenjo-daro provide a tangential but potentially relevant line of evidence for the ritual interpretation. Among the most discussed objects in Harappan archaeology is a steatite seal depicting a seated figure in a posture that some researchers have compared to the yogic meditation posture known as Mula Bandhasana, surrounded by animals including a tiger, an elephant, a rhinoceros, and 2 deer. The figure wears an elaborate headdress with 2 upward curving horns. Some researchers, including Marshall himself, identified this figure as a proto-Shiva, an early representation of the deity, who in later Hinduism is associated with both asceticism and animals. The identification would connect the Great Bath to a broader complex of ritual practices centered on the citadel, reinforcing the interpretation of the citadel as a religious precinct. The proto-Shiva interpretation has been challenged on multiple grounds. The posture of the figure, while broadly consistent with a meditative position, does not precisely match any documented yogic posture. The association of the figure with animals is not unique to Shiva iconography and appears in other ancient Near Eastern artistic traditions in the form of the Master of Animals motif, which does not necessarily carry religious significance specific to any particular deity. The identification relies on a reading backward from a later tradition to an earlier image, the same methodological problem that affects the broader ritual interpretation of the Great Bath. The image is striking, and its iconographic significance is not in doubt, but what it specifically meant to the Harappans who used the seal on which it appears cannot be determined from the image alone. What the Great Bath represents, in the absence of a deciphered textual tradition to clarify its function, is an architectural fact that resists definitive interpretation. It was built with extraordinary care at a prominent location within a city whose organization otherwise defies the standard templates of ancient urban hierarchy. Whatever it was used for, it mattered enough to the people who built it to justify a level of technical investment that went significantly beyond what functional necessity alone would have required. That investment tells us something about the values of Harappan civilization, even if it does not tell us precisely what those values were. The structural vocabulary of ancient political power is broadly consistent across early civilizations. Palaces mark the residence of rulers and the center of administrative activity. Temples mark the intersection of religious and political authority, often functioning simultaneously as the house of a deity and the administrative hub of a redistributive economy controlled by a priestly class. Throne rooms, audience halls, and treasury complexes provide the physical infrastructure through which rulers exercise authority, receive tribute, and project power to their subjects. The absence of any of these structures in the Harappan archaeological record is not a minor anomaly. It is a defining characteristic of the civilization, one that has forced researchers to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the relationship between urban complexity and political hierarchy. The most direct comparison is with Mesopotamia. The cities of Sumer and Akkad were organized around temple complexes that functioned as the economic and administrative centers of urban life. The ziggurat, the monumental stepped platform on which the temple of the city's patron deity was built, was the most prominent architectural feature of every major Mesopotamian city. The temple controlled large portions of the agricultural land surrounding the city, employed substantial numbers of workers, and maintained archives recording economic transactions, legal decisions, and administrative activities. The palace, when it emerged as a distinct institution in the later 3rd millennium BCE, operated alongside the temple as a parallel center of power, with its own administrative staff, archives, and economic resources. The physical prominence of temple and palace in the urban landscape was a direct expression of their social and political centrality. In Egypt, the connection between political authority and monumental architecture was even more direct. The pharaoh was simultaneously the supreme political ruler and a divine figure whose relationship with the gods was essential to the maintenance of cosmic order. The temples, mortuary complexes, and royal statuary that dominate the Egyptian archaeological record were not simply expressions of elite wealth. They were the material manifestation of a political theology in which the ruler's power derived from and was continuously demonstrated through monumental construction. The absence of comparable structures in the Harappan record implies either a fundamentally different political theology or a fundamentally different form of political organization. Several hypotheses have been advanced to account for the absence of identifiable palaces and temples in the Harappan record. One hypothesis proposes that the Harappan cities were governed by a council of merchants or civic leaders rather than by a single ruler, with political authority distributed across a group, rather than concentrated in an individual whose residence and administrative headquarters would constitute a palace. This model of oligarchic or council-based governance would explain the absence of a single dominant structure within the city, since no individual member of a governing council would have the authority or the social expectation to build a palace. It would also be consistent with the evidence for a trade-based elite, since merchant councils are a documented form of governance in later historical contexts, where commercial interests rather than military conquest define the basis of political authority. A second hypothesis proposes that religious authority in Harappan society was distributed rather than institutionalized, with ritual practice taking place in household contexts or in open civic spaces rather than in dedicated temple buildings. The evidence for household ritual in the Harappan record includes small figurines of animals in human forms, miniature vessels that may have served votive functions, and fire altars identified at some sites that suggest domestic religious practices. If Harappan religion was primarily a household practice, rather than a temple-based institutional religion, the absence of monumental temple architecture would reflect a genuine difference in religious organization, rather than a gap in archaeological visibility. The fire altars identified at certain Harappan sites deserve specific attention in this context. At Kalibangan, a site in present-day Rajasthan, archaeologists uncovered a series of brick-lined fire pits on the citadel mound that have been interpreted as ritual fire altars, suggesting a fire cult with possible connections to the Vedic tradition of fire sacrifice. If this interpretation is correct, it would represent one of the few direct links between identifiable Harappan ritual practice and later South Asian religious traditions. However, the interpretation has been contested, with some researchers arguing that the fire pits may have served industrial rather than ritual functions, and that the identification as altars reflects an assumption about Harappan religion rather than a conclusion drawn from the evidence. The absence of weapons and military fortifications in the Harappan record adds another dimension to the governance question. While some sites show evidence of perimeter walls, these walls do not conform to the design of military fortifications, as understood in other ancient contexts. There are no towers, no defensive ditches, no evidence of weapons storage in quantities that would suggest a standing military force. This absence has been used to support the hypothesis that Harappan governance was not militaristic, that political authority was maintained through economic and social mechanisms, rather than through the threat or exercise of military force. In other ancient civilizations, the military capacity of rulers was a primary basis of political authority, expressed in monuments celebrating military victories and in the weapons and armor deposited in elite burials. The absence of these markers in the Harappan record implies a different relationship between authority and coercion. The difficulty with all of these hypotheses is that they are constructed primarily from absences. The argument that Harappan governance was council-based, or that Harappan religion was household-centered, or that Harappan political authority was non-militaristic, rests on the absence of contrary evidence, rather than on positive evidence for the proposed alternative. Archaeology is a discipline accustomed to working with incomplete evidence, but the degree of interpretive uncertainty in Harappan governance studies is unusual, even by archaeological standards. The civilization's organizational capacity is demonstrated by what it built. The mechanisms through which that organizational capacity was generated and maintained remain almost entirely opaque. The documentary evidence for contact between the Indus Valley Civilization and the urban centers of Mesopotamia comes from multiple independent sources, and its implications extend well beyond the simple observation that the two civilizations were aware of each other. Harappan seals have been recovered from sites in Mesopotamia, including from the city of in contexts dating to the late 3rd millennium BCE. Mesopotamian texts from the same period refer to a trading partner called Meluha, described as a distant land to the east from which specific categories of luxury goods were imported. The identification of Meluha with the Indus Valley region is not universally accepted, but it is supported by a convergence of textual references, artifact distributions, and geographic analysis that most researchers find persuasive. If the identification is correct, it places the Harappan civilization within a documented commercial network that connected the ancient world from the Persian Gulf to the Indian subcontinent more than 4,000 years ago. The goods described in Mesopotamian texts as originating from Meluha include carnelian beads, etched carnelian beads produced through a technique that appears to be specifically Harappan in origin, lapis lazuli, gold, copper, ivory, and specific species of timber. The carnelian beads are particularly significant because the etching technique used to produce the distinctive patterned carnelian beads found at Mesopotamian sites matches the technique documented at Harappan production centers. The geographic distribution of these beads, found in elite contexts, in Mesopotamian cities, in royal tombs at and at intermediate sites along the Persian Gulf trade route, traces a commercial pathway that connected Harappan craft producers to the luxury markets of the ancient Near East across distances of several thousand kilometers. The logistics of this trade raise substantial questions about the organizational infrastructure that supported it. Long-distance maritime trade in the 3rd millennium, BCE, required ships capable of navigating open water, crews with navigational knowledge, facilities for loading, storing, and protecting cargo, and commercial relationships that provided both the credit mechanisms to finance trading voyages and the social or legal frameworks to enforce contracts between parties separated by large distances and belonging to different cultural and linguistic communities. At the Harappan coastal site of Lothal in present-day Gujarat, archaeologists excavated a large rectangular basin that was initially interpreted as a docking facility for trading vessels. The interpretation has been debated, with some researchers arguing that the basin was too far from navigable water to have functioned as a dock and may have served as a storage reservoir instead. Even if the Lothal Basin was not a dock, the density of trade-related artifacts at the site, including Harappan seals and weights, confirms its role as a commercial center involved in long-distance exchange. The intermediate sites along the Persian Gulf trade route provide additional evidence for the organizational complexity of Harappan long-distance commerce. The site of Dilmun, identified with present-day Bahrain, appears in Mesopotamian texts as a trading intermediary between Mesopotamia and Meluha, and archaeological finds at Bahraini sites include both Mesopotamian and Harappan artifacts, consistent with its role as a transshipment point. A similar intermediary function has been proposed for the site of Megan, tentatively identified with the coastal regions of present-day Oman and the United Arab Emirates, where Harappan pottery and weights have been recovered alongside local material culture. The existence of these intermediate nodes suggests a structured trading network with established way stations rather than direct point-to-point voyages between the Indus region and Mesopotamia. The direction of trade raises its own analytical questions. The goods identified as Harappan exports to Mesopotamia were primarily raw materials and craft products, stone beads, precious metals, timber, and ivory. The goods that moved in the opposite direction are less clearly documented. Mesopotamian texts describe gifts and tributes sent to Meluha, but the categories of goods involved are not always specified. Some researchers have proposed that Mesopotamia exported grain, wool textiles, and silver to the Indus region, commodities that would have been in demand in a large urban civilization, but that leave few distinctive archaeological traces. Others have suggested that the trade involved an exchange of craft goods in both directions, with Mesopotamian cylinder seals and luxury objects finding their way to the Indus region through the same networks that carried Harappan carnelian to Mesopotamia. The presence of Harappan seals in Mesopotamia and the apparent presence of Harappan merchants or trade agents in Mesopotamian cities is documented not only through the physical distribution of artifacts, but also through a small number of cylinder seals recovered from Harappan sites that appear to be of Mesopotamian manufacture, or to combine Mesopotamian and Harappan iconographic elements. These hybrid objects suggest direct contact between individuals from the two civilizations rather than indirect exchange through intermediaries, and raise the possibility that small communities of Harappan traders resided in Mesopotamian cities, maintaining the commercial relationships that sustained long-distance exchange. The documentary record for Mesopotamian merchant communities in foreign cities, which is well attested for later periods through the old Assyrian trade network at sites in Anatolia, provides a historical parallel for this type of trading diaspora, though direct evidence for a Harappan commercial diaspora in Mesopotamia remains inferential. What the trade evidence collectively demonstrates is that the Indus Valley Civilization was not an isolated phenomenon, but a participant in the broadest commercial networks of the ancient world. The organizational capacity required to sustain long-distance maritime trade at the scale suggested by the artifact distribution implies a level of commercial sophistication that is not fully reflected in the surviving material record from Harappan sites themselves. The trade connections also raise the question of what the Harappans learned from and transmitted to their trading partners, a question that bears on the broader issue of technological and cultural diffusion across the ancient world, and that cannot be answered without access to the textual record that the undeciphered Harappan script continues to conceal. The question of what caused the decline of the Indus Valley Civilization has been the subject of intense and sometimes politically charged debate for decades, and no single causal explanation has achieved consensus. Among the various hypotheses that have been proposed, the role of river system changes has become increasingly central to scholarly discussion, driven by satellite imagery analysis, paleoclimatological research, and geological studies that have together transformed the understanding of the hydrological environment in which the Harappan civilization developed and eventually contracted. At the center of this discussion is the Saraswati, a river identified in Vedic texts as a great river flowing from the mountains to the sea, whose physical existence and subsequent disappearance have become both a scientific question and a subject of considerable ideological contestation in South Asian historical scholarship. The identification of the Saraswati with a now dry river system visible in satellite imagery was first proposed by scholars in the latter half of the 20th century and has been supported by subsequent research using increasingly detailed remote sensing data. The dried river channel, sometimes referred to in geological literature as the Ghaggar-Hakra system based on the names of smaller seasonal rivers that still flow in parts of its former course, extends from the foothills of the Himalayas in the northeast across the plains of present-day Haryana, Rajasthan, and the Pakistani province of Sindh, ultimately reaching what was the Arabian Sea coast in the region of the Rann of Kutch. The channel is wide enough in satellite images to suggest that it once carried a substantial and perennial flow of water, comparable in size to the Indus or the Ganges during their high-flow periods. The significance of this identification for Harappan archaeology lies in the distribution of archaeological sites along the former river channel. When the locations of known Harappan settlements are plotted against the reconstructed course of the Ghaggar-Hakra system, a striking pattern emerges. A very large proportion of identified Harappan sites, some estimates suggest more than 60% of the total, are located along or near the former river channel rather than along the Indus River itself. If the Ghaggar-Hakra system was indeed the Saraswati of Vedic texts and was flowing as a major perennial river during the peak of the Harappan urban phase, then the Indus Valley Civilization was, in substantial part, a Saraswati Valley Civilization, and the drying of that river system would have had catastrophic consequences for the agricultural and urban populations settled along its banks. The mechanism proposed for the drying of the Saraswati involves the capture of its Himalayan tributary streams by the expanding river systems of the Yamuna and the Sutlej. Under this model, tectonic activity and river erosion caused the Yamuna, which currently flows eastward toward the Ganges, to migrate away from its earlier course in which it fed into the Saraswati system. Similarly, the Sutlej, which currently flows westward into the Indus, may have shifted its course away from a prior southward course that contributed to the Saraswati. The loss of these Himalayan tributaries would have reduced the Saraswati from a perennial, snow-fed river to a seasonal, monsoon-dependent stream, progressively diminishing its capacity to support the dense agricultural settlements along its banks. The timing of this hydrological change, if it can be established with precision, would provide a potential causal mechanism for the abandonment of Harappan settlements in the Ghaggar-Hakra region. The dating of the river capture events is, however, contested. Some geological studies have proposed that the Yamuna and Sutlej diversions occurred before the Harappan urban phase, which would mean the major Harappan settlements along the Ghaggar Hakra were built on the banks of an already diminished river rather than a major perennial system. Other studies have proposed later dates for the diversions, consistent with the hypothesis that the river was flowing strongly during the urban phase and dried substantially during or after the period of urban decline. The resolution of this chronological question requires paleoclimatic and geological data of a precision that current research has not yet definitively achieved, and the debate continues in the scientific literature with competing interpretations of the sedimentary and stratigraphic evidence. The political dimensions of the Saraswati debate have complicated its scientific resolution. In Indian nationalist historiography, the identification of the Harappan civilization with the Saraswati Valley is connected to broader arguments about the indigenous origins of Vedic culture and the continuity between the Harappan civilization and the later civilization described in the Vedic texts. If the Saraswati was the central river of the Harappan civilization, and if the Vedic texts preserve memories of that civilization, then the Harappans and the Vedic people may have been the same population, undermining the hypothesis of a later Aryan migration into the subcontinent. These historiographical and ideological stakes have meant that positions on the Saraswati question are sometimes shaped by political commitments as well as by the analysis of physical evidence, making it difficult to evaluate the scientific claims in isolation from the broader interpretive frameworks within which they are advanced. The monsoon variability hypothesis provides a complementary, rather than competing explanation for Harappan decline. Paleoclimatic studies using speleothem records from caves in the Arabian Peninsula and isotopic analysis of lake sediments in South Asia have documented a significant weakening of the Indian monsoon beginning around 2200 BCE, a period that corresponds broadly to a global aridification event known as the 4.2 kiloyear event. This climatic shift reduced rainfall across a broad region including the Indus Valley, with potential consequences for agricultural productivity and water availability in Harappan cities. The weakening monsoon and the simultaneous reduction in the Saraswati's flow would have created a compound hydrological crisis, reducing both the rainfall-fed streams that supplemented irrigation agriculture and the perennial river flow that sustained the settlements along the Ghaggar Hakra system. Whether these environmental pressures alone were sufficient to cause the abandonment of major urban centers, or whether they combined with social, economic, or political stresses to produce the observed pattern of urban decline, remains a question that the current evidence does not conclusively resolve. Few questions in South Asian historiography have generated as much scholarly controversy and political heat as the question of whether a migration or invasion of Indo-Aryan speaking peoples into the Indian subcontinent played a role in the decline of the Indus Valley Civilization. The hypothesis, in its original and most extreme form, proposed that pastoral nomads from the Eurasian steppes invaded the Harappan cities, destroying them militarily and displacing the indigenous population. This version of events, sometimes called the Aryan invasion theory, was partly inspired by the discovery at Mohenjo-daro of skeletal remains in positions suggesting sudden violent death, and was reinforced by interpretations of the Vedic texts in which the storm god Indra is described as a destroyer of cities. The hypothesis has been substantially revised or rejected by most mainstream researchers over the past several decades. But the debate over the relationship between the Harappans and the later Vedic culture of the subcontinent continues to generate significant scholarly and political controversy. The skeletal evidence from Mohenjo-daro that was initially cited in support of the invasion hypothesis was first analyzed in detail by the archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler, who identified a group of skeletons found in the upper layers of the site as massacre victims, killed during a violent conquest. Wheeler's interpretation was influential but was subsequently challenged on multiple grounds. Later analysis of the skeletal material found that the remains came from different stratigraphic contexts and different time periods, indicating that they had not died simultaneously in a single violent event. The skeletal material also showed no consistent evidence of weapon injuries that would be expected in a military massacre. The bones appeared to have been moved from their original burial positions, possibly by flooding, and redeposited in the contexts where they were found. The massacre hypothesis, as formulated by Wheeler, has been largely abandoned by the archaeological community, though the broader question of whether any form of conflict contributed to the end of the Harappan urban phase remains open. The Vedic textual evidence has been reinterpreted with equal complexity. The passages in the Rig Veda describing Indra as a destroyer of cities and fortifications were read by early researchers as a mythologized account of military conquest, with the cities destroyed by Indra representing the walled settlements of the Harappans. Subsequent analysis of these passages has questioned this interpretation on both philological and archaeological grounds. The Sanskrit term translated as city or fortification in the relevant passages is pure, which in its earliest Vedic usage may have referred to any enclosed or defensible space rather than to a permanent urban settlement. The passages can be interpreted as descriptions of mythological conflicts between divine and demonic forces rather than as historical accounts of military conquest, and the assumption that they refer specifically to Harappan cities imports a historical specificity that the texts themselves do not require. The genetic evidence that has emerged from ancient DNA studies in the past decade has added new dimensions to this debate without fully resolving it. Studies analyzing ancient DNA from skeletal remains at Harappan and post-Harappan sites have documented a complex pattern of population movement and admixture in South Asia during the 2nd millennium BCE. The data supports the presence of ancestry related to the Yamnaya pastoralists of the Eurasian steppe in populations associated with the Vedic period, consistent with a migration from the steppe that introduced Indo-Aryan languages into the subcontinent. However, the timing and scale of this migration and its relationship to the decline of the Harappan urban phase remain subjects of active research and debate. Crucially, the genetic data does not support the original invasion hypothesis in its violent form. The Harappan individuals whose DNA has been analyzed show genetic profiles consistent with a population ancestral to present-day South Asians, with no evidence of a sudden replacement of the Harappan population by a genetically distinct invading group. The steppe ancestry that characterizes later South Asian populations appears to have been introduced through migration and admixture rather than through conquest and population replacement. This is consistent with a model in which Harappan populations continued to exist and eventually mixed with incoming migrants, with the urban culture of the Harappan phase ending not through violent conquest, but through the complex interaction of environmental pressures, economic disruption, and gradual demographic change. The linguistic dimension of the debate remains particularly complex. The Harappan script cannot be read, so the language of the Harappan population is unknown. The hypothesis that the Harappans spoke a Dravidian language rests on indirect evidence, including the distribution of Dravidian languages in South Asia today, with Brahui, a Dravidian language, still spoken in the Balochistan region near the core Harappan territory, suggesting a possible linguistic continuity with the Harappan population. If the Harappans spoke Dravidian languages, their relationship to the later Indo-Aryan Vedic culture would involve not just demographic change, but a language shift in northern South Asia, with Dravidian languages retreating southward under the demographic and cultural pressure of Indo-Aryan expansion. This model is consistent with the general linguistic geography of South Asia today, but cannot be confirmed without decipherment of the Harappan script. The debate over the Aryan question is unusual in the degree to which its scientific content has become entangled with contemporary political and identity questions. In India, The relationship between the Harappan and Vedic civilizations bears on claims about the ancient roots of Hindu civilization and the indigenous versus migrant origins of the Vedic tradition. In Pakistan, the Harappan civilization has been claimed as a pre-Islamic national heritage whose relationship to later South Asian cultures is interpreted differently. These political stakes have not prevented rigorous scientific work, but they have meant that interpretations of the evidence are frequently evaluated not only for their scientific adequacy, but for their political implications, creating a research environment in which the boundary between scholarly debate and ideological contestation is sometimes difficult to locate. The decline of the Indus Valley Civilization did not occur as a single catastrophic event. The archaeological record documents a process of gradual urban contraction and cultural transformation that extended over several centuries, beginning around 1900 BCE and continuing through approximately 1300 BCE. This process has been divided by researchers into phases, with the late Harappan period representing the transformation of Harappan material culture following the abandonment of the major urban centers. Understanding the late Harappan phase requires moving beyond the narrative of collapse and attending to the specific patterns of settlement change, material culture transformation, and population dispersal that the archaeological evidence documents. What emerges from this examination is not a picture of sudden destruction, but a more complex process of fragmentation and regional differentiation that raises its own set of unanswered questions. The most visible aspect of the Harappan decline is the abandonment of the major urban centers. Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, and the other large cities that defined the mature Harappan phase were progressively depopulated during the early 2nd millennium BCE. The process of abandonment appears to have been gradual rather than sudden at most sites. The upper layers of occupation at Mohenjo-daro show evidence of declining urban maintenance, with drainage systems falling into disrepair, buildings being subdivided and reused in ways inconsistent with the original architectural plan, and craft production standards declining relative to the mature Harappan phase. This pattern is consistent with a population that was shrinking and losing the organizational capacity to maintain the city's infrastructure, rather than with a population that was forcibly expelled or killed. The question of where the urban population went is answered in part by the proliferation of smaller settlements in the eastern and southern parts of the Harappan territory during the late period. The regions of present-day Haryana, Gujarat, and the upper Ganges-Yamuna Doab show evidence of increased settlement density during the period when the major western cities were being abandoned. This eastward and southward movement has been interpreted as a response to the environmental deterioration of the core Harappan territory, with populations moving toward regions with more reliable rainfall and river systems, as the hydrological conditions in the Indus Valley and along the Ghaggar-Hakra system deteriorated. The settlement pattern suggests an organized and relatively gradual migration rather than a panicked flight from catastrophe. The material culture of the late Harappan phase shows a progressive departure from the standardization that characterized the mature period. The standardized brick ratios that had been maintained consistently across the civilization during the urban phase are abandoned, with later sites using brick dimensions that vary between localities. The long-distance trade networks that had connected the Harappan world to Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf decline and eventually disappear, with the latest Harappan contexts showing no evidence of the carnelian bead production or the use of standardized weights that had characterized the mature trading economy. The script, which appeared consistently on seals and tablets during the urban phase, becomes increasingly rare in late Harappan contexts and eventually disappears entirely, leaving no direct descendant writing system in the subsequent cultures of the subcontinent. The regional cultural traditions that emerged during the late Harappan period have been given distinct archaeological designations reflecting their geographic distribution and specific material characteristics. The Cemetery H culture, identified at Harappa itself in a cemetery that postdates the mature Harappan occupation of the site, shows both continuities with and departures from the mature Harappan tradition. The pottery styles are distinct from mature Harappan ceramics, incorporating new decorative motifs including peacocks and pipal trees that have been interpreted as culturally meaningful symbols. The burial practices differ from earlier Harappan norms, with Cemetery H burials using fractional burial in which skeletal remains are placed in ceramic vessels rather than laid in a fully articulated position. Some researchers see in these changes evidence of a new population arriving at the site, while others interpret them as transformations within a continuing Harappan population adapting to new cultural circumstances. The Jukar culture in Sindh and the Rangpur culture in Gujarat represent similar regional transformations, each maintaining elements of the Harappan technological tradition while developing distinct material identities that diverge from the uniform, mature Harappan standard. The persistence of Harappan technological elements, including the use of fired brick in some contexts, and the continuation of certain ceramic forms, within these regionally differentiated late cultures, suggests that the Harappan population did not simply disappear, but transformed, adapting to changed environmental and social conditions while losing the organizational framework that had sustained the urban phase. The transformation was not extinction, but fragmentation, with a formerly integrated civilization dissolving into a collection of regional cultures that retained Harappan elements without reproducing the Harappan urban system. The chronological overlap between the late Harappan regional cultures and the early stages of the Vedic tradition in the subcontinent is a subject of ongoing research and debate. If some late Harappan populations were already present in the Ganges-Yamuna region, when the initial phases of Vedic culture were developing, the interaction between these populations and the incoming Indo-Aryan speakers would have produced precisely the kind of cultural synthesis and language shift that the genetic and linguistic evidence suggests. The late Harappan fragmentation phase may not represent the end of the Harappan story, but the beginning of a process of cultural transformation whose products are partly visible in the complex synthesis of the later South Asian tradition. The question of population dispersal following the decline of the Harappan urban centers is one of the most consequential and least resolved in South Asian archaeology. A civilization that at its height may have supported a population of several million people across its urban and rural settlements did not simply cease to exist. The people who had lived in Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, and the hundreds of smaller Harappan towns and villages went somewhere, adapted to changed circumstances, and contributed genetically and culturally to the populations that came after them. Tracing that dispersal requires integrating archaeological settlement data, paleodemographic analysis, genetic studies, and the evidence of material culture continuities and discontinuities across the transition from the Harappan to the post-Harappan period. The integration of these different lines of evidence produces a complex picture that defies simple summary, but suggests several distinct patterns of population movement. The eastward dispersal into the Ganges-Yamuna plains is the best documented of these movements in terms of settlement archaeology. The period between 1900 and 1500 BCE sees a significant increase in archaeological site density in the regions east of the Harappan core territory, in areas that had been relatively sparsely populated during the mature Harappan phase. Sites in the Upper Ganges-Yamuna Doab, the region between the two river systems in present-day Uttar Pradesh, show ceramic traditions that have elements derived from the Harappan technical tradition alongside local innovations. The copper hoard culture, identified by the discovery of large copper hoards and anthropomorphic figures in the same region, has been tentatively linked to populations descended from or influenced by late Harappan traditions, though the connections are not definitively established. The overall pattern suggests a substantial eastward movement of population following the abandonment of the western urban centers, with migrants settling in a region whose agricultural potential was less stressed than the deteriorating Indus Valley environment. The southward dispersal into Gujarat and the Deccan Plateau is documented through the persistence and evolution of Chalcolithic cultures in those regions that show Harappan technological influences. The Aharbanas culture of Rajasthan and the Malwa culture of central India maintain craft traditions that have points of contact with the Harappan technological repertoire, suggesting either direct migration of Harappan populations into these areas or the diffusion of Harappan technologies through trade and interaction networks as the urban system contracted. The question of whether these cultural connections represent actual population movement or simply the transmission of technological knowledge is difficult to resolve from the material evidence alone, and the distinction matters for understanding the scale and nature of the demographic transition. The genetic evidence for Harappan population dispersal is still in its early stages, limited by the small number of ancient DNA samples recovered from securely dated Harappan and post-Harappan contexts. The samples analyzed to date suggest that the Harappan population was genetically related to the broader South Asian ancestral population, with no evidence of significant genetic contribution from outside the region. In the post-Harappan period, the genetic profiles of populations in South Asia reflect a mixture of this indigenous South Asian ancestry with the steppe-related ancestry associated with the Indo-Aryan migration. The proportion of this mixture varies across different regions of South Asia, consistent with a model in which the steppe-related ancestry was introduced primarily into the northwestern parts of the subcontinent and spread southward and eastward through subsequent population, movement, and admixture, rather than through a single migration event. The question of rural continuity is frequently overlooked in discussions focused on the collapse of the urban centers. The Harappan civilization was not exclusively urban. The major cities were embedded in a broader landscape of smaller towns, agricultural villages, and pastoral settlements that made up the majority of the population. Many of these rural and semi-urban settlements may have experienced less severe disruption during the period of urban decline than the major cities did, and may have maintained greater continuity of population and cultural practice across the transition to the post-Harappan period. The concentration of archaeological attention on the major excavated sites of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa has created a picture of the civilization's decline that may overrepresent the urban disruption and underrepresent the rural continuity. The coastal populations of Gujarat and the Makran coast present a specific case of potential continuity that connects to the broader question of maritime trade networks. The Persian Gulf trade networks that had carried Harappan goods to Mesopotamia did not disappear immediately with the decline of the major inland cities. Evidence for continued maritime activity in the Persian Gulf region during the late 3rd and early 2nd millennium BCE suggests that coastal trading communities may have maintained commercial relationships with the Gulf world, even as the inland urban network contracted. These coastal communities, if they persisted as functional trading entities through the transition period, would represent a specific example of organizational continuity within a more broadly disrupted Harappan world, and their subsequent history would have important implications for understanding the post-Harappan maritime tradition of the Indian Ocean. The cumulative picture that emerges from these multiple lines of evidence is one of demographic dispersal rather than demographic collapse. The Harappan population did not disappear. It redistributed, fragmented, and in many areas persisted with varying degrees of material culture continuity. The disappearance was not of people, but of the organizational framework that had sustained the urban phase, the shared standards, the long-distance trade networks, the script, and the administrative or social mechanisms that had maintained coherence across a vast territory. What dissolved was a civilizational system, not the human population that had created and inhabited it. Understanding why that system proved unable to sustain itself under the environmental and social pressures of the early second millennium BCE and what replaced it are questions that the evidence addresses only partially. The relationship between the Indus Valley Civilization and the Vedic tradition that emerged in the Indian subcontinent during the second millennium BCE is one of the most consequential and contested questions in South Asian cultural history. The Vedic texts, composed in an archaic form of Sanskrit and preserved through oral transmission before being written down in much later periods, constitute the oldest surviving literary corpus from South Asia and the foundation of the Hindu religious tradition. They describe a society of pastoral and semi-agricultural communities performing elaborate fire sacrifices, organized around clan and tribal structures, led by warrior chieftains and priests, with a sophisticated cosmological and ritualistic framework expressed through a highly developed poetic tradition. This Vedic society appears, at first examination, to have little in common with the urban, apparently non-militaristic, and materially distinct civilization of the Harappans. The question of how these two cultural traditions relate to each other, whether through displacement, transformation, synthesis, or independent parallel development, has profound implications for the understanding of South Asian cultural origins. The traditional scholarly position, developed primarily by European philologists and archaeologists in the 19th and early 20th centuries, held that the Vedic tradition was introduced into the subcontinent by migrating Indo-Aryan-speaking peoples from outside, and that this migration was in some way responsible for or associated with the end of the Harappan civilization. This position has been substantially revised, but not entirely abandoned. The current mainstream scholarly view acknowledges a migration from the steppe region during the second millennium BCE while rejecting the violent invasion model and remaining agnostic about the precise relationship between the migrants and the declining Harappan urban tradition. The revised migration model does not require that the incoming Indo-Aryan speakers destroyed the Harappan cities, only that they eventually became a demographic and cultural presence significant enough to shift the linguistic landscape of northern South Asia from whatever language or languages the Harappans spoke to the Indo-Aryan Sanskrit of the Vedic texts. The Vedic texts themselves preserve what may be cultural memories of a more complex world than the pastoral society they primarily describe. The Rig Veda contains references to urban settlements, to elaborate craft production, to long-distance trade, and to social complexity that some researchers have read as indirect evidence of contact with or knowledge of the Harappan urban tradition. The hymns to Indra describe a deity who acts in the world, defeating enemies, releasing imprisoned waters, and destroying the strongholds of adversaries in ways that have cosmological significance within the Vedic framework, but that may also encode memories of environmental events or social conflicts from the period of Harappan decline. Whether these textual elements represent genuine historical memory or are entirely mythological constructions without historical reference is a question that cannot be resolved through textual analysis alone. The archaeological evidence for the transition period in the core Harappan territory is more informative than the textual evidence about the specific mechanisms of cultural change. The sites that show late Harappan occupation, followed by painted gray ware culture occupation, which is generally associated with the early Iron Age period and with the social world described in the later Vedic texts, document a material culture transition that took place over several centuries. In the intermediate period, between the late Harappan and the painted gray ware phases, some sites show occupation by cultures that do not fit neatly into either category. Cultures with ceramic traditions and settlement patterns that represent hybridized or transitional forms between the Harappan and Vedic material worlds. These intermediate cultures may represent the material trace of the population mixing and cultural synthesis that the genetic evidence suggests took place during this period. The iconographic continuities between Harappan material culture and later South Asian religious traditions have been a persistent subject of scholarly interest. Despite the methodological difficulties of tracing connections across a gap of several centuries, the Proto-Shiva seal from Mohenjo-daro has already been mentioned. Other iconographic elements found in the Harappan corpus, including depictions of the pipal tree, which is sacred in both Hindu and Buddhist traditions, representations of a mother goddess or female deity figure, and the presence of animals with probable totemic or symbolic significance, such as the unicorn depicted on Harappan seals, have been identified as potential precursors to later South Asian religious iconography. The case for continuity is circumstantial but not trivial, and it has motivated a body of scholarship attempting to trace the transmission of specific symbolic elements from the Harappan tradition into the later religious cultures of the subcontinent. The linguistic substrate evidence provides another potential window into Harappan cultural survival within the Vedic tradition. Linguistic analysis of the Rig Veda has identified a number of words in the Sanskrit text that appear to be borrowings from non-Indo-European languages, including words for specific agricultural practices, local plants and animals, and certain cultural concepts. Some of these substrate words have been proposed as borrowings from Dravidian languages, consistent with the hypothesis that the Harappan population spoke a Dravidian language that influenced the Sanskrit of the Vedic tradition as the two populations came into contact and eventually merged. Other substrate words may belong to languages unrelated to either Indo-Aryan or Dravidian families, suggesting that the linguistic landscape of pre-Vedic South Asia was more complex than a simple two-language scenario would imply. The possibility that specific technological and agricultural knowledge associated with the Harappan civilization was transmitted into the Vedic and later South Asian tradition is supported by some indirect evidence. The sophisticated water management practices of the Harappans, including the construction of reservoirs and irrigation channels, have analogs in later South Asian hydraulic traditions, and some researchers have proposed lines of transmission between the two. The bead-making and craft traditions associated with Harappan production centers show continuities with later South Asian craft traditions that suggest the survival of specific technical knowledge across the cultural transition. These potential continuities do not demonstrate that the Harappan and Vedic traditions are directly related, but they suggest that the transition was not a complete cultural replacement and that elements of the Harappan technical and cultural heritage survived in forms that were eventually absorbed into the new civilizational framework that emerged in South Asia during the second millennium BCE. The history of attempts to decipher the Indus script is a record of methodological ingenuity applied to a problem that continues to resist resolution. And understanding why the decipherment has failed despite a century of effort illuminates both the specific challenges posed by the Harappan script and the broader epistemological requirements that successful decipherment demands. The decipherment of an unknown script is not purely a cryptographic puzzle. It requires identifying the underlying language, establishing the structural type of the writing system, and finding a way to anchor the interpretation to independently verifiable data. For the Indus script, each of these requirements presents obstacles that have not yet been overcome, and The interactions between these obstacles create a problem of exceptional difficulty. The most fundamental requirement for decipherment is a known language. Every script that has been successfully deciphered in the modern era was ultimately cracked because researchers could identify, with reasonable confidence, the language encoded by the script and use knowledge of that language to constrain and test proposed sign values. Egyptian hieroglyphics were deciphered by Champollion because the Rosetta Stone provided the same text in Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic, allowing the hieroglyphic values to be mapped against a known language. Linear B was deciphered by Michael Ventris because he hypothesized correctly that it encoded an archaic form of Greek, and the hypothesis could be tested against the extensive knowledge of Greek already available to scholars. The Indus script has no Rosetta Stone equivalent, and the language it encodes is entirely unknown, removing the most powerful tool available to decipherers. The sign inventory of the Indus script presents a structural challenge that compounds the language identification problem. As noted earlier, the script contains approximately 400 to 600 distinct signs, a number that falls between the typical range for alphabetic and logographic systems. This ambiguity in structural type means that researchers must simultaneously hypothesize the language and the type of writing system, with each hypothesis affecting the interpretation of the other. If the script is logosyllabic, the sign values will differ fundamentally from what they would be if the script is primarily syllabic or primarily logographic. The short average inscription length of approximately 5 signs means that the corpus provides insufficient data to distinguish confidently between these structural possibilities using statistical methods alone. The computational approaches to decipherment that have been applied to the Indus script since the 1970s have used statistical analysis of sign distributions and sequencing patterns to make structural inferences. These analyses have generally concluded that the sign distribution patterns are more consistent with a genuine linguistic writing system than with a non-linguistic sign system, a finding that argues against Sproat's hypothesis that the script is not language encoding. However, statistical consistency with a linguistic system does not identify the language or establish sign values. Computational analysis can constrain the range of plausible structural interpretations, but cannot by itself achieve decipherment. The most systematic decipherment attempt, the multi-decade project of Asko Parpola and his collaborators, uses a combination of statistical analysis, iconographic interpretation, and comparative Dravidian linguistics to propose readings for individual signs. Parpola's method relies heavily on the rebus principle, in which a sign depicting a recognizable object is assigned the phonetic value of the Dravidian word for that object, allowing it to be used phonetically in contexts where the phonetic value rather than the pictographic meaning is intended. This method has been productive in identifying plausible phonetic readings for some signs, but the readings are difficult to verify independently because the proposed Dravidian word forms are reconstructions rather than attested forms, and because the overall translation of any inscription depends on all sign values being correctly identified simultaneously. The work of Iravatham Mahadevan, the Indian epigraphist who compiled the most comprehensive concordance of Indus inscriptions before his death in 2018, combined statistical and comparative approaches to propose that certain recurring sign groups on the Harappan seals represent titles or designations, possibly encoding the names of deities or clan identities. Mahadevan's analysis of the sign frequencies and combinatorial patterns identified certain signs as probable function markers, distinguishing between signs that appeared to play grammatical roles and signs that appeared to carry semantic content. This functional analysis, while not constituting a full decipherment, represented a significant contribution to understanding the internal structure of the script and provided a framework within which subsequent decipherment attempts could be calibrated. The possibility that the Indus script encodes a language with no known relatives or descendants is the most pessimistic scenario for decipherment, and it cannot be excluded. The linguistic diversity of South Asia before the spread of Indo-Aryan and Dravidian languages was potentially very high, with multiple language families represented in a region that had been inhabited continuously for tens of thousands of years. The Barusho language of the Karakoram region and certain isolated languages of South Asia have been proposed by some researchers as possible relatives of the Harappan language, but these proposals are highly speculative and have not achieved scholarly acceptance. If the Harappan language belongs to a family with no surviving relatives, the constraints available to decipherers from comparative linguistics would be entirely absent, making the combination of unknown language, unknown writing system structure, and insufficient text length into an effectively insoluble problem with current methods. The implications of continued failure extend beyond the specific question of what the Indus seals say. The undeciphered script represents a permanent gap in the historical record of one of the world's foundational civilizations, a gap that affects every aspect of Harappan scholarship. Questions about governance, religion, social structure, trade relationships, and the mechanisms of urban organization that other ancient civilizations answer through their texts remain open for the Harappans. The script sits at the center of the Harappan mystery not because decipherment would solve all the outstanding questions, but because it would provide the framework within which those questions could be investigated with a different order of evidential richness. The ruins of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa have been excavated, analyzed, debated, and theorized about for more than a century, and the result of all that intellectual labor is a paradox. The Indus Valley Civilization is simultaneously one of the best documented and least understood of the ancient world's great urban cultures. Its physical remains are extensive and well preserved. Its geographic scale and technical achievements are clearly established. The broad outlines of its chronology are known. And yet the fundamental questions about how it was organized, why it built what it built, what its people believed, and why the urban system ultimately failed have not been answered with the confidence that comparably extensive research has achieved for ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. The silence that pervades the Harappan record is not simply an absence of evidence. It is itself a form of evidence, and understanding what that silence means requires moving beyond the frustration of unanswered questions toward an analytical engagement with what the specific pattern of the silence reveals. The most revealing aspect of the Harappan silence is its selectivity. The civilization did not fail to leave material remains. It left them in extraordinary abundance. What it did not leave are the specific categories of material that ancient civilizations typically produce when political power is organized around individual rulers, when religion is institutionalized in a temple bureaucracy, or when military authority is a primary basis of social hierarchy. The absence of royal monuments, palace archives, temple economic records, and military trophies is not a random absence. It is the specific absence of the material culture of a particular kind of political organization, the kind that produces visible, durable markers of concentrated individual or institutional power. This selectivity in what is absent suggests that the Harappan civilization may have been organized in a genuinely different way from the palace-centered civilizations of the ancient Near East, and that the differences were structural rather than accidental. The theoretical implications of this possibility have not been fully worked through in the archaeological literature. Most models of social complexity in pre-modern societies treat the centralized palace-temple state as the standard or default form of complex organization, against which other forms are measured as variants or deviations. The Harappan evidence challenges this assumption by demonstrating that a civilization capable of planning and constructing large cities, maintaining technical standards across vast distances, sustaining long-distance trade networks, and organizing the labor and logistics of extensive construction programs could do all of this without generating the archaeological signature of a palace-temple state. If the Harappan case is valid, it implies that the range of organizational forms capable of sustaining urban complexity is broader than the dominant models of ancient state formation have acknowledged. The work of researchers including Shireen Ratnagar has developed the theoretical implications of Harappan social organization in ways that draw attention to the commercial and craft production dimensions of Harappan complexity rather than its political or religious dimensions. Ratnagar's analysis emphasizes the evidence for a sophisticated urban economy, organized around specialized production and long-distance exchange, with social stratification expressed through differential access to imported luxury goods and craft products, rather than through the monumental display of political authority. This economic interpretation of Harappan complexity is consistent with the material evidence and does not require the hypothesis of a powerful centralized state, but it raises its own questions about the social mechanisms through which a large and geographically dispersed urban system maintained its internal coherence over several centuries without the coercive institutions that palace economies used to manage their populations. The question of what ended the Harappan urban system is, in this analytical context, a question about which specific aspects of the system's organizational logic were vulnerable to the environmental and demographic pressures of the early second millennium BCE. If the system depended critically on the agricultural productivity of the Saraswati Valley and the Indus floodplains, then the hydrological deterioration documented by the paleoclimatic record would have undermined its economic foundation in ways that could not be compensated through organizational adaptation. If the system depended on the maintenance of long-distance trade networks for the import of specific resources and the export of manufactured goods, then the disruption of those networks during a period of broader regional instability in the ancient Near East, which is well documented for the same period, would have removed economic foundations that the urban system could not replace with local resources. The dispersal pattern of the late Harappan period is consistent with a system that did not collapse catastrophically, but lost its integrative capacity gradually, with populations relocating to areas of lower environmental stress rather than dying in place. This pattern suggests a population with sufficient organizational capacity to execute a strategic response to environmental deterioration, moving toward better watered regions in an organized way, rather than simply starving in the deteriorating core territory. The fact that later South Asian populations carry significant genetic ancestry from the Harappan population confirms that the demographic outcome of the urban decline was dispersal rather than extinction. What disappeared was not a people, but a civilizational configuration, a specific and historically unprecedented arrangement of urban planning, technical standardization, commercial organization, and social governance that produced the cities of the mature Harappan phase. That configuration was not reproduced in the post-Harappan period, and no subsequent South Asian civilization before the modern era built cities of the administrative planning sophistication achieved by the Harappans at the height of their urban phase. The knowledge, whatever form it took, that allowed the Harappans to conceive, plan, and maintain those cities was not transmitted intact to subsequent generations. Whether it was lost through the disruption of the social networks that had sustained it, through the demographic mixing that followed the dispersal and migration of the late period, or through the linguistic and cultural shift associated with the emergence of the Vedic tradition, cannot be determined with the evidence currently available. The silence of the Harappan cities is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of a civilization that operated according to principles that did not require the forms of material self-advertisement that have allowed other ancient cultures to speak to researchers across 4 millennia. The Harappans built cities that functioned with a precision their contemporaries did not match, and that their successors did not replicate. They maintained a shared technical and commercial culture across a vast territory without leaving records of the institutions through which that culture was maintained. They declined and dispersed without leaving monuments to the rulers who presided over the process. What they built and what they did not leave behind together constitute one of the most distinctive and analytically challenging records in the archaeology of the ancient world. A civilization that commands attention not primarily through the drama of its collapse, but through the depth of the questions that its very existence continues to pose.